A Nightmare on Elm Street, Part 3, The Dream Warriors, Novelization. Chapter 4. "You sure drink a lot of coffee," Neil said. Nancy shrugged as the waitress in the coffee shop refilled her cup.
Habit I got into
She hesitated.
when I was in high school. So, you have a private practice when you're not at the hospital playing savior?
"Sure," said Neil. "I interpret dreams at a local carnival."
They pay you in popcorn?
Some. Mostly, I get $100 an hour.
People pay you to tell them about their dreams?
"Are you kidding?" Neil said, not noticing the serious tone that had crept into Nancy's voice. "For $100 an hour? I dream for them,"
That's a good idea.
said Nancy, staring off into the distance. "What's a good idea?"
Paying someone to have your dreams.
There was an awkward moment of silence before Neil spoke once again. "Anyways, your folks still live around here?" he asked.
My mom's dead.
Said Nancy a little too quickly.
She died in her sleep.
"I'm sorry," said Neil.
My father disappeared. Right around the time my mother died. I tried to find him for a long time. Traveled all over. Then I came back.
Nancy paused and looked Neil straight in the eye. And then she said,
I used to have bad dreams.
Neil nodded and took a sip of his coffee. Sometimes he wondered how people ever talked at all without coffee to sip during the awkward pauses between topics. "Dr. Madalena said you had some experience with kids who were hurting themselves?"
There was some trouble on Elm Street years ago. Some people died. Nothing on this scale, though.
Nancy looked up and put her hand on Neil's wrist.
Do you believe in other realities?
She asked. "You mean like the Wizard of Oz?" asked Neil with a grin.
Forget it.
Said Nancy, withdrawing her hand. "Hey, I'm sorry," said Neil, genuinely regretting his flippant remark. I was only joking,"
Don't patronize me.
said Nancy angrily.
There are things I have to tell you about these kids. Important things.
"Terrific," said Neil. "Only, let's not talk here. Why don't we go over to my place, break out a bottle of semi-expensive wine, and have a serious talk?"
I don't drink.
Said Nancy. "Instant coffee, then? How's that sound?" Nancy smiled in spite of herself. Neil Guinness could be infuriating, but Nancy didn't seem to be able to stay mad at him for more than a few moments at a time. It wasn't until they were at his house and she told him about the model that she found in Kristen's room that he really made her angry. "All right," said Neil, adding a carefully measured spoonful of sugar to his coffee cup. "For the sake of argument, let's suppose she never saw the house on Elm Street before, and somehow she builds a perfect model of the house you lived in when you were a kid. What does that prove?" He took a sip of coffee and shrugged his shoulders. "Maybe she'll grow up to be your real estate agent,"
You're not being funny.
said Nancy, deciding that perhaps the time had come to tell him the whole incredible story.
Something really amazing happened last night. While I was home in bed, Kirsten was in the hospital having a nightmare.
"This is getting scary," said Neil with a big grin on his face.
You know something? You may have advanced degrees up the ass, but you don't know anything about people.
She jumped to her feet and started heading for the door. "Wait a minute," said Neil, chasing after her. I was only..."
You don't really care about what's wrong with these kids. You just want to get everything under control, get your gold star, and go home.
"That's bullshit, Nancy, and you know it," said Neil. "I care just as much as you do. I just don't happen to think that it's such a great idea to start believing in my patient's delusions."
There are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in your philosophy, Neil Guinness.
"Okay, said Neil, reluctantly conceding the point. Maybe I'm not always as open-minded as I could be. A person gets kind of cynical after a few years in med school. But I'm trying. Please, give me another chance, would you? Nancy glared at him for a long moment, sighed deeply, and sat back down.
Pour me another cup,
she said. Most of the time, Max enjoyed working at Weston Hills. Not that being an orderly in a county mental hospital was the greatest job in the world. The pay was lousy and the hours were worse. Still, working at the hospital made Max feel as if maybe he were doing somebody some good, and that was more than he could say about any other job he had ever had in his life. Having Doc Guinness around made a big difference, too. The doc really cared about these kids, and he seemed to share Max's belief that you can't always go by the book. Helping the kids get better was the important thing, and rules and regulations were only there to be used or ignored, depending on what was best for the kids in that moment. Unfortunately, Dr. Madalena didn't seem to see things the same way. As far as Max could tell, the Dragon Lady believed that rules and regulations were the end-all and be-all of running an institution. If the kids had to suffer, so be it. Patients come and go, but the hospital is forever. Max felt like wringing Doc Madalena's scrawny neck sometimes when she treated the kids as though they were case studies in some kind of psychiatric textbook. Max never finished high school, but there was no doubt in his mind that he knew more about people than the Dragon Lady ever would, despite all her fancy degrees and diplomas. He sometimes wondered why God, in his infinite wisdom, gave people like Dr. Madalena the power to hire and fire honest, hard-working guys like him and Doc Guinness. Max tried not to worry about the world's many injustices that night as he made his evening rounds. Thinking of such things just made him angry, and more anger was the last thing these kids needed to deal with in their lives. Nighttime in hospitals is tough for everyone, and the kids and adolescents seemed to have it especially rough after lights out. To Max, sleep meant a welcome relief after a hard day's work, a time to set his problems aside and refresh himself for the new day to come. It was different for these kids, though. He had the feeling that they were all afraid to sleep, and he was sure Doc Guinness could help them if somebody could just figure out why. Until then, it was Max's job to make sure they all got through the night as best they could. "Lights out, gentlemen," he said, knocking lightly but firmly on the door to Joey and Laredo's room. "But Max," Laredo began to protest. "I know," said Max with a gentle smile. "You don't sleep. Well, neither does Doc Madalena, and she'll have my black ass in a sling if she comes around here and sees lights on after hours." Max felt a special fondness for these two kids. Joey couldn't have been more than 15, his body already frail and twisted like that of an old man. Laredo wasn't much older, but he always looked out for the younger boy, more like a big brother than a hospital roommate. What really amazed Max about Laredo, however, was his incredible imagination. Laredo seemed to dwell in a world of magic and fantasy, spending endless hours forging the tiny clay figures of wizards and kings and monsters that filled his side of the room. Max loved to listen in when Laredo entertained Joey and the others with his complex sagas of enchanted castles and fearless warriors. He was sure the boy knew the difference between reality and his own vivid imaginations, yet his magical tales were woven with such conviction that sometimes even Max forgot they weren't real. Joey's side of the room looked practically empty next to Laredo's. The only decorative item on Joey's nightstand was the remarkable model house that the Parker girl had given him. There was something almost frighteningly real about that house, Max thought, as if Kristen had been driven to reconstruct some actual house down to the last minute detail. "Max," said Laredo, interrupting the orderly's thoughts, Can I get my clay out of the arts and crafts room? Make it fast, said Max, nodding his head. Max didn't know exactly what was troubling Laredo, but he knew the boy needed to make his tiny clay figures to maintain his sanity. Sweet dreams, Joey, said Max, gently mussing the boy's bushy hair. Then he turned off the light and moved on down the hall to Kincaid's room. The huge boy's frail young roommate, Philip, was already fast asleep. Hey, Max, said Kincaid, nodding his head in Philip's direction. I think the kid's starting to walk in his sleep again. As long as he brings back coffee and donuts, said the orderly. Kincaid laughed as Max turned off the light. Max tried not to let the kids see him worrying, but sleepwalkers were actually one of his greatest concerns. Max couldn't be everywhere all the time, even if the Dragon Lady expected him to be. If a sleepwalker slipped past him one night and got himself hurt, Max didn't know what he would do. It was something he tried not to think about. Max was no longer worrying about sleepwalkers an hour later, as he sat in the staff lounge watching TV. Maybe if he hadn't been laughing quite so hard at Johnny's monologue that night, he might have heard Philip's soft footsteps as the boy lurched past the doorway behind him. He certainly would have noticed the stiff, unnatural way in which the boy was walking, like a poorly constructed marionette operated by an inexperienced puppeteer. Carefully, Max would have guided the boy back to bed, shut the door behind him, and made it back to the lounge before Johnny introduced his first guest. What he would not have seen was the leering figure of Fred Krueger guiding poor Philip every uncomfortable step of the way, his strong hands hooked under the boy's armpits, and his tattered shoes wedged beneath the boy's bare feet. Only Philip knew that it was the evil man in the filthy sweater who yanked him from his bed each night, forcing him to lurch awkwardly through the darkened hallways in his ill-fitting hospital pajamas. Why? The boy had asked the first time, nauseated by the dreadful stench of his tormentor's burnt flesh. Why me? Why? Freddie had replied, grinning as he drooled unconcernedly on the back of Philip's neck. Because I like you! Laredo was not asleep the night Freddie waltzed Philip past the doorway of the TV lounge. He had stayed longer than he had meant to in the arts and crafts room that night, and happened to peek out the door just as Philip lurched by. He was about to go to the boy and steer him back to his room when something very odd happened. For just one fleeting instant, Laredo thought he saw the man in the red and green sweater standing behind Philip. He blinked his eyes and took another look. The image had flashed by so quickly that Laredo didn't know whether he had actually seen someone or just imagined it. Laredo was well aware of his own overactive imagination, and he often thought of the weird man who used to haunt his nightmares. Back when he used to sleep at night, that is. It had seemed so real, and yet... And then he saw it again. It only lasted for a fraction of a second. But there was no doubt in Laredo's mind that Philip was not alone, especially after the boy passed through an unopened door. "Kincaid?" said Laredo, shaking the large boy out of his sleep. Kincaid opened one eye. "This better be good, man," he growled threateningly. Then he looked across the room and saw Philip's empty bed. "Come with me," said Laredo. Kincaid grumbled a few of his favorite obscenities and followed the smaller boy out into the hallway. They raced quietly down the corridor until they reached a window at the end of the hall. Philip was about to step off the curb in front of a speeding ambulance. "Leave him alone!" screamed Kincaid, punching his fist through the locked window, as the laughing man in the red and green sweater flung Philip in front of the onrushing vehicle. "Look both ways!" Okay, Slashaholics, this has been Chapter 4 of A Nightmare on Elm Street 3, The Dream Warriors, the novelization by Jeffrey Cooper. There's some good things I got to say about this chapter and a couple bad, maybe it's not bad things, maybe it's just, well, we'll get there. First off, great job Cecilia Spears voicing the role of Nancy. Really enjoy having you on board on these books. Thank you for being a $15 patron, and thank you for playing these roles that you get as a reward on the Patreon page, you know. And if anybody listening would like to voice a character in any of the books that I do, all you got to do is sign up on Patreon for $15 a month, and you get to voice a character each month in an audiobook. And as far as tonight's upload goes, I love the back and forth with Nancy and Neil. I enjoy it a lot more in the book so far. It's a little bit more than I do in the movie. And I think it's going to be more of a struggle in the book for Nancy to get Neil on board with everything. But maybe after he sees everything with his own eyes, like in the movie, maybe that'll be all it takes. But I see this version of Neil being even a little bit more doubtful than the Neil from the movie. Moving on from there, I want to talk about another key difference in the movie and this novelization, and that would be Philip not being like a puppet guy, you know, a maker of these puppets and stuff. Laredo makes the clay figurines and stuff for his Dungeons and Dragons type game. But anyways, I was really expecting, you know, the whole puppet walk scene with the tendons and all that being ripped out and becoming a marionette puppet. But instead, we get the original draft of the script that made this novelization. So instead, Freddy's just like putting his arms under Philip's armpits and putting his feet under Philip's feet and walking him down the hall. It's still pretty creepy that there's nothing Philip can do about that, and Philip gets tossed right in front of oncoming traffic. That's still a really gruesome death. Kind of cool, you know, kind of a cool way to kill off one of the characters early on the book here. But yeah, you know, it's just lacking that awe of the movie with the whole. Because I mean, I got to tell you, every time I watch Dream Warriors and the puppet walk happens, every muscle, tendon, vein, vessel, whatever in my body hurts when I see that scene. And I just didn't get that with this alternate death the way it was in the original script. So that is one difference in this book that I'm not real happy with, and I wasn't excited to narrate. I was really disappointed. I mean, I got to admit, I was disappointed when it wasn't the puppet walk. But I did like Freddy's one-liners there. It's because I like you! And, look both ways! You know, that kind of made the scene okay. But it just wasn't the same. And I'm sure you guys probably feel the same. Let me know in the comment section below if you were disappointed that it didn't include the puppet walk and everything that comes with that, you know. Like Freddy turning into the little puppet, and then the tendons being ripped out of Philip's arms and becoming the strings for the marionette. I did like how Kincaid is just as aggressive in his reaction to everything going on as in the movie. You know, it made sense in the movie that they weren't able to snap Philip out of it and everything because he was like way upstairs away from them and they had the glass between them. But Laredo was not in his room in the book here. He was in the Arts and Crafts Center. So it seems like he could have like maybe tried to jump, grab him, drag him back. I don't know. But Philip's dead. It wasn't the same way as the character was killed off in the movie. But it wasn't horrible. It was just kind of lackluster. I think that's the word I'm looking for. I've heard there's some pretty gruesome deaths in this book compared to the movie, so I'm not giving up hope yet. But as for Philip's death, I gotta say the movie wins as far as that scene goes. Alright guys, I'll be back very soon with more of A Nightmare on Elm Street 3, The Dream Warriors. Until then, this has been your friendly neighborhood 80s slasher librarian saying, thanks for listening, look both ways, and pleasant dreams.